What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with Tech Daily, and in this video, we are going to be comparing the Samsung Galaxy A52 to the Samsung Galaxy A72. Now, in years past, these two devices would usually have a number of different features and specs that separated them from one another and made the higher-end phone, in this case the A72, noticeably better. This year, however, these phones are closer than ever, and there are just a couple of small things now that set them apart. I'm going to talk about those differences and all the similarities as well in this video, and hopefully by the end this will help you decide if either device is right for you. Before we jump into it though, I do just want to mention that for the purposes of this video, we'll be talking about the regular international 4G LTE versions of these devices. There is an A52 5G, which is a totally different device, but that's not what we're using here to compare. So first off, physically, I think it's pretty obvious that these two phones look almost identical. They have the same design and materials, they both come in the same set of colors too, but you might be able to tell they differ just slightly in size. The A52 is the smaller device at 6.5 inches, that's the screen size, while the A72 is a 6.7 inch phone. Really though, side by side, the difference is almost negligible. The A72 is just a few millimeters taller by comparison. You can just barely see how much more screen real estate you're actually getting there, and width-wise, the difference is even harder to tell. You're not gaining a whole lot more screen on the A72 in my opinion, and by comparison, it's not like the A52 is any more compact of a device either. You basically are deciding between a big phone and a slightly bigger phone, and I really wouldn't put that much thought into it either way. Across the front, both phones have identical center hole punch camera cutouts up top, relatively slim bezels along the sides, and a slightly larger chin down at the bottom. So what you see, at least up front, is basically identical on both phones. And around back, with the rest of the housing, it's the exact same story. Both these devices have the same metal polished frame and matte plastic rear cover. They have the thicker, boxier design with squared off sides, and there's absolutely no difference with the fit, finish, materials, look, or feel. It's all exactly the same. So while in some cases, going with a higher model or more expensive device might sometimes yield you better materials, that is not the case here at all. Furthermore, both phones now offer an IP67 water and dust resistance rating, which is great to see. So not only are the actual materials the same, the protection they offer is the same as well. And that's actually a new feature for these two A-series phones. We didn't see water resistance at all last year. And in the 2021 A-series lineup, actually, these two higher end phones are the only ones that got this. And just quickly taking a look around at everything else, like I said, it's all going to be the same here. So you've got the same SIM and SD card tray up top, identical power and volume buttons on the sides, a headphone jack, and USB-C charge port on both, and the same dual speaker setup now on these two phones. There's the usual bottom facing speaker there, but there's also a secondary speaker in the earpiece, and I'm really happy to see that. In my opinion, the out loud listening experience on these two devices is really great, and fortunately, to me, they do sound the same as well. Here's a sample so you can get an idea. Now, around back, while the camera setups look to be the same, there are a couple of differences here, and this is the first real feature and spec difference between the two phones, and I'll get into that in just a second. Underneath the display though, both phones have their in-display fingerprint reader, and I believe this is going to be the same sensor and setup on both phones. They kind of go back and forth on which one unlocks first, but more often than not, it's about the same speed, and I don't really see any advantage here either way. It's the same story with Face Unlock too. While sometimes one phone might get me in quicker, just sort of randomly, majority of the time, the wake and unlock function seems to be identical on both phones. And this makes sense. I'm not aware of any fingerprint sensor or selfie camera hardware differences on either device. And actually, going back to the display here, that minor difference in size I mentioned earlier is the only difference we get. Both these new phones get the upgraded 90 Hz panel, which is really awesome. I think it's a totally expected move to have it on the A72 being the higher end device, but seeing it come to the A52 as well might actually actually make this phone be a slightly better value in comparison. And to me, everything looks and feels the same here. It's a great screen with a 90Hz mode enabled. It's fast, it's fluid, it's a solid addition, not only for both these devices in particular, but also just for them to compete in the mid-range space. And I'm really glad they had this setup. The actual displays themselves also offer identical specs as well. They're both Super AMOLED panels at the same resolution, 2400 by 1080, 20:9 aspect ratio. The pixel density does differ just a little bit since the screen sizes are different. You get 407 pixels per inch on the smaller A52 and 394 pixels per inch on the larger A72, but that's not something you're going to be able to tell at all. In general, the viewing experiences here should be pretty much the same. I know in my experience the color calibration is a little off. Whites and blues tend to differ, but I don't necessarily think that's on purpose. The specs, the hardware, the setup, it all should be the same, and you aren't getting any real advantage one way or another with the screens. They're both great viewing experiences. They're big, bold, bright panels at 800 nits of brightness, and you can't go wrong with either. Like I said already too, them both offering 90Hz as well is just a great added bonus. And I guess more than anything, since that is a feature on the cheaper A52, that might be the only slight advantage if you really want to make that comparison. So up to this point, these two phones are more or less identical. The minor size difference exists, but beyond that, there isn't a spec or a feature or an add-on with either phone that you can use to differentiate them. Now, usually this is where the internal specs and performance would actually set them apart, but for whatever reason this year, Samsung just decided to stick the same set of specs and internals in both devices. They're both powered by the same Snapdragon 720G chipset. The A52 starts at 4 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage, but it has 6 and 8 gig options with 128 and 256 gigs of storage, just like the 6 and 8 gig, 128 and 256 gig A72. So essentially almost all the same specs, RAM, and storage options and configurations. And this is really surprising because you are still paying more for the A72, but with this, you just aren't really getting more. These phones to me perform almost the same, and I think this is another instance where it just kind of makes more sense to get the A52 instead, since it's cheaper, but you're missing out on literally nothing. I'm not really sure why Samsung decided not to give the A72 a little more here. Not that the 720G processor is bad, but it's maybe not as powerful as some of us would have liked to see. And with everything else pretty much equal here, like I said, it just seems to make way more sense to save the money, sacrifice nothing, and grab the A52 instead. Now, there is actually one more internal component to consider here, and that's the battery capacity. And this does differ a little bit. The A52 packs a 4500 mAh battery inside, while the A72 has a slightly larger 5000 mAh battery. And to me, this is something that could yield a little more life out of the A72, but I don't necessarily think it's a decision maker. The A72 does technically have that slightly larger display, so that could draw a little bit more battery. But even with getting a little nitpicky there, I think there's probably a little more potential still for the A72 to stretch out its life a little longer during the day. Furthermore, I do just want to mention that inside the box, the A52 gets the older, slower, regular USB charging brick for some reason, even though it technically supports 25-watt fast charging. The A72 does get the faster 25-watt brick in the box. And I know most people have tons of chargers at home already, but I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out. All in all, there does seem to be some battery and charging differences between these two phones, but I'm not sure it's that drastic of a difference. Finally, let's talk about all those cameras around back. And honestly, out of every little aspect on these two phones, this is, I think, the only difference in specs or capabilities that's genuinely noticeable. Now, most of the camera tech and shooting modes are the same. The 64 megapixel main lens on both phones is the same, as well as the 12 megapixel ultra wide and 5 megapixel macro. But while the A52 has a 5 megapixel depth sensor, the A72 gets a much more useful 8 megapixel telephoto lens. And this to me is a great addition. You're going to get 3 times optical zoom and up to 30 times digital zoom on the A72, which means not only is it just much more capable in zooming in from much farther away, but the quality at any zoom level is going to be significantly better than what you'd get on the A52. So that, I think, is potentially worthwhile. Everything else though, with the shooting modes and features and add-ons, once again, appears to be the same across both phones. Nothing from the settings page to the feature set to the shooting modes seems to be different at all. And actually in practice, with just everyday shooting, the results between these two phones are super close as well. And this actually makes sense. The main lens and the selfie camera are all the same. The processor is the same, the camera app and the Android version and the One UI update are all the same too. So the end result should be the same as well. I'm seeing the same level of detail, same color profile, same exposure levels. To my eyes, I don't see any noticeable difference between any of the picture results. And this is kind of surprising only because if you guys remember last year, I made a whole video about how much better the A71 was over the A51 with its camera setup. So this time around, evening things out is a really interesting tactic. All in all, the difference between these two phones can really just be summed up like this. The A72 is the slightly larger device, but you don't get much more usable space. It has a slightly larger battery that may yield a subtle difference in longevity, and it also has a telephoto lens in the camera setup. That's it. Everything else about these two phones is 100% identical. And this to me is just really surprising because the A72 is obviously the higher model. It's the more expensive device. But in my mind, it just makes way more sense to get 99% of the same features and specs on the A52, but save some money in the process. I'm really surprised the A72 doesn't offer more in comparison, that it doesn't really differentiate itself. And I feel like it's usually in Samsung's best interest to do that just because people will flock to the cheaper device instead if there's no incentives. And in this case, I just don't really see one. So if you're deciding between these two devices, just get the A52 instead. You'll save a ton of money and get basically the same phone in the end. So there you go. That's everything you need to know about the A52 and A72. What do you guys think? Is there any real reason to go with the A72 instead? Maybe I missed something. Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow Tech Daily on Twitter and subscribe to the Tech Daily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.